He's motivated by a mixture of insatiable greed and madness.
He is not irrational. He is not a madman, which makes him very dangerous.
If there's one word that characterizes Milosevic, it's being a master at betrayal.
He's happiest when he's in a state of war, and that's when his popularity is the highest.
The only thing Milosevic cares about is power.
Sickening power. He needs to stay in power at any price. So dying people don't bother him.
United States forces, acting with our NATO allies, have commenced airstrikes against Serbian military targets in the former Yugoslavia.
And with that, bombs began dropping, refugees fled in terror, and the world was horrified by the action sparked by one man. That man is the President of the Republic of Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevici. His first name means freedom, and he rose to power by tapping into ancient Serbian emotions. The most important event in Serbian history took place in the 14th century on a battlefield in Kosovo, the Holy Land of the Serbs. There, in June of 1389, the Eastern Orthodox Serbs fought the invading Muslim Turks. On the eve of that battle, Serb leader Prince Lazar rallied his troops with a speech that Slobodan Milosevic would echo some 600 years later.
It is better to die in battle than to live in shame. Better it is for us to accept death from the sword in battle than to offer our shoulders to the enemy.
The next day, after the dust settled, Lazar was dead, and the Serbs had lost their independence. This defeat still lives on in the cultural memory of the Serbian people. For many Serbs, June 1389 is just like yesterday.
There's an expression which is, here in the Balkans we have too much history. The world doesn't begin now, today. It begins in 1389. It begins at the Battle of Kosovo Polje. And nothing, in a sense, I don't think any other nation on earth has that kind of memory and that kind of collective memory that they have. It's not something you can rationalize. It's not something that we can think of. It's a very Balkan thing.
For the next 600 years, the Serbs were under the thumb of either the Ottoman or the Austro-Hungarian empires. As these dynasties began to weaken in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Serbs saw a chance to re-establish their nation. In 1914, a radical Serb nationalist assassinated Austria-Hungarian ruler Archduke Franz Ferdinand and started World War I. It was at the end of that war that Yugoslavia was born out of the shards of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires. The new nation faced the daunting task of trying to integrate all its ethnic and religious groups. It seemed impossible to do. Political infighting continued until 1941, when the Nazis marched in. By the time the war was over, the first Yugoslavia was dead, and from its pieces, Allied leaders put together another country, known in history books as the Second Yugoslavia. This new country consisted of 6 republics: Serbia, Macedonia, Croatia, Slovenia, Montenegro, and Bosnia. At the head of this new government was the leader of a wartime communist resistance group, Josip Tito. He now had to keep his country from spontaneously combusting. One of his strategies was to outlaw nationalist demonstrations.
Tito's premise was a federal Yugoslavia of republics, but republics tied together by a party and also army apparatus on the Soviet pattern, so that the differences between the republics or their borders would be like lines on a column.
Josip Broz Tito was an incredible politician, and he was a charismatic figure. He was also an autocrat. And what this communist leader succeeded in doing was playing the various nationalities of Yugoslavia off of one another. And so they would be rivalries that would somehow be suppressed. People were encouraged to follow and believe this slogan, brotherhood and unity, meaning that everyone was together, they were equal, they were the sense of let's all nationalities be together.
It was in this Tito-led Yugoslavia that Slobodan Milosevici grew up. When he was born on August 20th, 1941, his parents named him the Slavic word for freedom. Milosevic's father, who had trained to be an Orthodox priest, left the family when Slobodan was only 5. In his life, Milosevic would endure the suicides of his father, his mother, and his favorite uncle.
Milosevic comes from, I guess what you'd have to call it, and I don't mean to be irreverent, a dysfunctional family, but of the highest order. His father deserted the family and later committed suicide. His mother, a Communist Party official, also committed suicide. A favorite uncle of the Milosevic family also committed suicide. I don't know quite how that affects a person, but of course it does affect a person's psyche.
In later years, Slobodan would rarely speak about his past.
I remember vividly when the New York Times ran a story about his parents and their background and their suicides. He really was angry, and his face was a study in fury because he was so furious at this. So obviously it's a very deep issue to him.
As a boy, Milosevic had few, if any, friends. He didn't play sports and was seen by other students as a plodding, serious boy. Most classmates assumed that he would end up as an undistinguished clerk.
Milosevic was a shy and isolated person who did not form close friendships. If anything, his closest friendship, and maybe his only true friendship, may be that with his wife, Mira Markovic, who is his high school sweetheart.
When Slobodan and Mira met, they instantly realized that they shared troubled childhoods, and they grew to depend on each other.
His wife was the product of a rather casual liaison between two important resistance fighters during World War II. As the story goes, she stopped for only a day in the forest to give birth to her daughter, Mira, and then went back to a resistance fighting, was then caught by the Nazis, tortured, and then executed. So she really grew up without either parent. And in many ways, you can kind of consider this union as two wounded people who found each other.
Throughout their lives, Slobodan and Mira would provide refuge for one another. And in the 1990s, this high school love story would have horrific consequences for Yugoslavia. After high school, Slobodan and Mira headed to the university in Belgrade. She to study sociology and he law. Both became deeply involved in the Communist Party, the only route to power in Yugoslavia.
I think Slobodan Milosevic was an incredibly ambitious and capable student. I think he knew what he wanted. He also, at law school, his best friend was Ivan Stambolic, who came from a very powerful political family.
Slobodan remained close to Stambolic after graduation and followed his friend from one job to another, taking over each position that Stambolic vacated. First at the state-run gas company, then at the state-run bank. Even then, Milosevic was known as a stubborn man.
Milosevic was never willing to compromise. The only way he did compromise was when he had no way out. Even back then, he was known as a person who would do anything to reach his goal, whatever it takes. When he was still a manager, he would use all means available to get what he wanted, either by firing people who disagreed with him, by replacing them, or harming them in some other way.
As a banker, Milosevic traveled to many Western countries, including America. In New York, he learned to speak English and to enjoy the nightlife.
Well, I think he spent a lot of time drinking cappuccinos in coffee shops, hanging out at the Blue Note, enjoying the cultural life of New York. He has a real appetite, apparently, for Western culture.
Jeste, recimo kad je bio predsjednik banke.
When he became a bank manager, he told me to choose a place where I'd like to work so that he could send me. As a joke, I said Peking, China. But he said, don't be silly. You cannot learn anything there. You should go to the West, Zurich, New York. So the way he was thinking then was much closer to Western philosophy.
When not traveling, Milosevic and his wife lived in one of Belgrade's concrete neighborhoods.
They thought of themselves as bohemians. She dressed in black, and her trademark, which still is a flower behind her ear. And they're inseparable, inseparable. And apparently when he went to do his military service, he sent her so many love letters that the postman came to the door and knocked on it and said, I just wanted to meet the woman who's inspired this many love letters.
The couple had 2 children, a daughter, Maria, born in 1963, and a son named Marco, who followed 9 years later. Family life did not deter Milosevic's calculated rise within the Communist Party, and he did it all with Mira by his side. She has been compared to Lady Macbeth, the scheming, powerful woman behind the man.
I think essentially he is a simple man. I think the sort of pomp and circumstance doesn't appeal to him. He's very much a grey suit, old-fashioned communist. I don't think he's very comfortable living the life that she wants. He likes being the center of attention in a political sense, but she likes being the center of attention in a more stylish, flashy way.
Under Tito's total rule, life was predictable for Mira and Slobodan, but even great dictators cannot control their own death, and in 1980, Tito died in his sleep at the age of 88. Unfortunately for Yugoslavia, no charismatic leader emerged to fill the power vacuum left by Tito's death, and that was partly Tito's own fault.
In the wake of the Croatian political challenge in the late 1960s, Tito had purged the Republic Party leaderships of liberals and really their best people, not just in Croatia, but in Serbia preeminently. Slobodan Milosevic and those who emerge with him are the second rank of people who are reliable but not inspiring.
Now leadership passed to a collective presidency, which rotated power among leaders of Yugoslavia's 6 republics. Not surprisingly, the result was an unstable political mess, with each president fighting on behalf of his own constituency. As for Milosevic, he continued to benefit from his connections. When Ivan Stambolic took over the Communist Party in 1984, he chose his good friend Milosevic to run the Communist Committee in Belgrade. In the late 1980s, Serbs living in Kosovo began protesting to Belgrade about their ill treatment at the hands of the Albanian majority. In April of 1987, Stambolic sent his loyal colleague Slobodan Milosevic to Kosovo to calm the Serbs. But far from calming the Serbs, he ignited their passions with a seemingly extemporaneous speech. He promised, "No one will dare to beat you again." It turns out his words were anything but spontaneous.
Now, the whole thing was completely organized, and the secret police had brought in a truck full of stones. The TV Belgrade was filming it, and Milosevic, through his cronies in the television station, put it on the air day in and out. Within a matter of months, he was able to rally people on the streets in Kosovo and in other places, and he managed to oust Stambolic.
With that speech, this seemingly unimaginative career communist was smart enough to rip open the wounds of centuries of Serb victimhood.
And I think whenever you have a situation of downtrodden people who are suffering and who aren't having a good life, they're very vulnerable to a leader, however sociopathic he is. They don't see that. What they see is someone who's going to save them.
And that was somehow the image which Milosevic managed to convey. Follow me, and I will lead you to a strong Serbia united against our enemies.
Milosevic seemed transformed by the emotion of that day. Gone was the obsequious clerk. Without so much as a backward glance, Milosevic grabbed for power while he had the chance. And in so doing, he betrayed his friend and mentor, Ivan Stambolic.
If there's one word that characterizes Milosevic, it's being a master at betrayal. Because he's intensely charming on the one hand, and people think they have a rapport with him. And then he uses and discards. He's really quite ruthless in doing this.
His capacity to betray his closest subordinates and to use people and throw them away as though they were nothing reveals a coldness and ruthlessness that is striking even in that part of the world where such qualities are not uncommon in political leaders.
Suddenly, on that one Friday in April, Yugoslavia was set on a dramatically new and ultimately violent course. 1989, the year that communism throughout Europe would crumble. 1989 was also the year Slobodan Milosevic tightened his grip on Kosovo and released the genie of Serbian nationalism in the Balkans. As head of the Communist Party, Milosevic revoked autonomy to the Kosovo province of Serbia in March of 1989. Autonomy had been granted under Tito and resented by the Serb minority living there ever since. Serb police fired into crowds of demonstrating Kosovars, killing 23. Slobodan Milosevic was elected president of Serbia 2 months later, becoming one of the most powerful leaders within the Republic of Yugoslavia. On June 28th of 1989, hundreds of thousands of Serbs from all over the globe converged at their sacred battlefield, the Field of Blackbirds, to commemorate the battle Serbs lost 600 years before in 1389. President Milosevic was the star speaker.
Hundreds of thousands of Serbs gathered in Kosovo on the battlefield of where the Serbs had lost the Battle of Kosovo, the Field of Blackbirds. And they had gathered, they had come from all over Yugoslavia, they had come from abroad, and these people came to hear Milosevic. And Milosevic, by then, there were many speakers, but he was really the central figure. And by then, he had achieved the status as the protector of all Serbs.
What Milosevic did in 1989 was he preyed basically on the desire of the Serbs for respect. They had no other symbol. They had no other political leadership. They had no one else who spoke to them. And so he went to Kosovo, he stood in that field, he made this historic speech, he invoked the past, he invoked all the ghosts of the past, he called upon them to help him create Greater Serbia. That was what he needed, that was his political vehicle. They are his tools. He has used them to sustain and manage his power.
And it was then that he made clear two things. He made very, very clear that he didn't care what the other leaders from the other national communities in Yugoslavia thought about him. And he also made clear that he was the most powerful man in Serbia.
The former Communist Party functionary had found in nationalism the tool for his own political advancement.
I think to understand Milosevic, one should understand that he's a political opportunist whose main goal in life is to retain power. He is not an ultra-nationalist of the sort like Radovan Karadzic and the Bosnian Serb leaders. He is, power is his goal, not an ideologically based regime.
Throughout 1989, much of Europe struggled to reinvent itself in a post-communist era. New leaders like Lech Wałęsa and Václav Havel gained power. The old communists were replaced. On Christmas, the Romanian dictator and his wife were executed before a firing squad. As president of the so-called Collective Serbia, Milosevic looked to consolidate his own power base and exploit the ethnic differences. his Serb police and army cracked down on the Kosovars, essentially Muslim people who speak a different language than the Christian Orthodox Serbs.
And for the next few years, Kosovo was a virtual police state. First, there were the very visible signs of repression, i.e. police tanks. But then, even when those disappeared, there was basically an apartheid system, so that the two communities were at odds for the next decade with episodes of violence.
Elsewhere in Yugoslavia, the republics that had been held together under Tito, who had managed to suppress nationalism, seemed to have become infected by the virus unleashed by leaders like Milosevic. In the Yugoslav state of Croatia, Franjo Tuđman also invoked nationalist symbols bearing old wounds. By the fall of 1990, Slovenia and Croatia were drafting their own constitutions for independence from Yugoslavia. Tiny Slovenia was first to go, and Milosevic didn't put up much of a fight. In 1991, ethnic Serb rebels living in Croatia, armed by Milosevic, declared their own tiny autonomous statelet, and war broke out. The same pattern occurred in the state of Bosnia. Increasingly threatened by the Milosevic brand of Serb nationalism, multi-ethnic Bosnia declared independence in 1992. Ethnic Serbs living in Bosnia were also funded and armed by the Milosevic regime. In Bosnia, the Serb military forces used tactics of terror, snipers, and rape to drive out civilian populations and gain territory. Heavy artillery compensated for a lack of infantry. It was the bloodiest fighting in Europe since World War II.
These were his wars, there's no question about that. They are wars of his manufacture. They are wars that, in a sense, he sought, that he believed, if you believe that politicians act in a rational way, that he must have believed would somehow benefit him and his hold on power.
The siege of Sarajevo lasted more than 3 years, and innocent civilians were daily targets.
Well, recall that Milosevic was responsible for designing, engineering, financing, equipping the Bosnian Serbs, and the chain of command for the atrocities of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia have direct links between the Bosnian Serb leadership and Belgrade. He had proxies who were involved in doing the dirty work, but the real masterminding was done from Belgrade.
Milosevic denied responsibility for the atrocities.
During the war in Bosnia, Milosevic would look Western mediators in the eye and say, "What's happening? Never heard about it. Bodies? Don't know anything about it."
Sve ima pod kontrolom.
He's a man who has everything under his control. He makes sure that he's always informed about everything. Nothing ever happened without his approval.
I onda je apsolutno bio informisan.
I think that the evidence is probably strongest with regards to the massacres that took place at Srebrenica. We know from our reporting that there are intercepts held by the international community, now held by the International War Crimes Tribunal, which clearly show a link between generals in Republika Srpska and generals in Yugoslavia proper as those massacres were carried out.
The wars across Bosnia and Croatia were only settled when the Serbs began losing ground. Milosevic cut off support to the Serb enclave in Croatia, and about 200,000 Serbs were evacuated, leading to more charges of ethnic cleansing from both sides. Efforts at peace talks failed, and Sarajevo sustained more shelling. Finally, in August 1995, NATO bombed Serb forces in Bosnia. The Serbs backed down. Negotiations for a lasting settlement could now begin in Dayton, Ohio. By the time of the Dayton Accord, several Bosnian Serb leaders had been indicted as war criminals. This meant the Serb who would sit down at the bargaining table was Slobodan Milosevici of Serbia. The West effectively made him the guarantor of the peace, and in so doing elevated his world status. American diplomats got to know the man well.
Negotiating with Milosevic is very difficult. He is extremely tactically flexible. He changes positions quickly. He changes moods quickly. He mixes enormous amounts of humor at times into his discussion.
He's been described as a charmer, and this is how Americans may remember him at Dayton, where the press waxed eloquent about President Milosevic smoking cigarillos, drinking Johnny Walker, karaokeing with American negotiators. And he certainly exhibited a great deal of charm and apparent sensitivity during this time. Yet it's a false charm. It's a malignant kind of charm. It's the charm of a con man.
Due to successful conclusion of the negotiations in Dayton,
the political talent of Slobodan Milosevic lies in his ability to manipulate reality to his people. He survives despite losing the wars he has started.
In a civil war like this one in Bosnia, there are no winners, and there could be no winners. All are losers. Only peace is a victory.
Until now, the man is a winner. Yes, there are losses. He lost Slovenia, he lost Croatia, he lost Bosnia. On every count, you can say he lost the war. But this is a man who, like other dictators that we are familiar with, has a talent for turning losses into victories. He has turned every one of those losses psychologically, emotionally, into victories for the Serb people. And that is one of the ways in which he helps to sustain his own power.
But the thing that stands out in my mind as I remember my visit there in 1994 was how revered Milosevic was at that time. And not just because he was their hometown hero. It was clear that they saw him as a kind of god, the god of the Serbs, someone who had restored these people's faith in themselves as Serbs.
After the 1995 Dayton Peace Accords, President Slobodan Milosevic returned home to a struggling nation. He had hoped international sanctions against his country would be lifted, but many remained in effect. As the rest of Serbia slipped toward poverty, the ruling elite controlled a booming black market and most hard foreign currency.
All this money is not in Yugoslavia. It's fled the country. It's in Cyprus. It's in other offshore banking centers. And it's used in this network to fund Milosevic's government still, his military activities, his paramilitary activities, his state security police activities, and of course to keep the people who are supporting him in money. Milosevic's role is sort of the grand godfather. He himself doesn't seem interested in wealth, although his children do. His son owns a disco, has been involved in cigarette and auto smuggling, was in business with a fellow who was shot and executed a couple years ago. Nobody knows who did that, and that murder hasn't been solved. His daughter runs a radio station and is sort of on the social scene. His wife is very politically active, was a columnist, and is still sort of the woman behind the strong man.
She has a political life all of her own. She has a political role all of her own. She is not simply the First Lady of Yugoslavia. She has a career as a politician.
Mira is a writer, self-professed clairvoyant, and a sociologist, who many say is an unreconstructed communist and the real power behind the throne.
She is very tough. There is no question that she never wavered through the Bosnian Wars, never once. If he may have had doubts, if he may have shown that he had doubts at various times, she never wavered.
Their two children are tremendous problems. Marco, second day of the NATO bombing here, tried to open Bambi Land, which is a sort of Disney World in Serbia. Tasteless. Their daughter Maria is difficult. And they're feared in Serbia. That's the thing. When you try to get people to talk about them, when you go to the town where they're from, people are very concerned. They have their own little mafia.
While the Milosevic family thrived under sanctions, dire economic conditions in Serbia contributed to demonstrations against Milosevic and to the growth of political opposition.
They're very brave people in Serbia, many of them who braved sub-zero weather to demonstrate against Milosevic in December and January 1996-97. It's a tragedy that they didn't receive more international support because that was their best moment.
Milosevic deftly co-opted opposition leaders and caused infighting. Their message was further neutralized by his total control of the media and his use of the secret police. In 1997, the legal term limit for the presidency of Milosevic had run out, but that didn't stop him. He simply changed his title. Milosevic declared himself president of the Yugoslav Federation, previously a ceremonial post, and continued to rule as before. He aggressively pursued the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo, who in turn formed paramilitary units of their own, known as the KLA.
So the conflict was bubbling along for about a year and a half with this pattern of several Serbian policemen would be killed and then they would hit back against the ethnic Albanians. But it wasn't really a war until about a year ago when there was the first effort by the Serbian police forces to really stamp out the KLA. And what happened was basically a massacre.
The Kosovo crisis had reached critical mass.
I believe that he takes risks and actually creates crises because he does have a great deal to lose. It's when the country is dissident, when he's receiving lack of support, when people are being faced with the magnitude of the bankruptcy within that nation. At that point, he creates a crisis, and now the attention is directed and deflected outwards rather than towards him. So this is actually a crisis creator.
Whether or not the nationalism of Milosevic is heartfelt or craven opportunism, his disdain for his ethnic Albanian opposition is clear to American officials.
We talked specifically about the problem in Kosovo, and it was clear that he had great contempt for the ethnic Albanians. In fact, at one point in the meeting, he indicated that the entire separatist movement was funded by ethnic Albanian doormen from Park Avenue in New York. His contempt for the Albanians pervaded the conversation.
The paranoid direction of Milosevic's personality is rather effective in sincerely conveying the problem isn't here, it's out there, the enemy, they are the ones. And in fact, all successful destructive charismatics succeed by sincerely locating the problems out there with an outside enemy.
By 1998, the Kosovar opposition was armed and dangerous, and Milosevic's Serb police and paramilitary were engaged in a bloody and bitter civil war. Many civilians were killed by Serb forces. Kosovo was the flame that could ignite the Balkans like a string of firecrackers. Only this time, there was potential for the fire to spread further, as Greek, Turk, and even Russian interests were understood to be threatened. The West wanted concessions on both sides in Kosovo, with armed NATO peacekeepers to enforce an agreement. Milosevic made known his feelings about any potential Kosovo deal in a 1998 Newsweek interview.
I asked him, can you make a deal in Kosovo? Or if you make a deal, will it be very unpopular at home? Would you be able to make a deal, or would it be so unpopular that you couldn't make a deal? And he said, essentially, no, I could not make a deal on Kosovo because Kosovo is the heart of Serbia. I cannot give it away. And so he gave every warning, I guess, of what he was going to do.
International talks on Kosovo were held in February 1999 in Rambouillet, France, outside Paris. A plan was outlined where Kosovo would regain autonomy but remain part of Yugoslavia. but the Serbs refused to endorse a provision calling for NATO troops on Kosovo ground during a transition period.
We had, on the eve of the bombing, I felt that we had entered an area of extreme unreality, because when I asked him to stop the military offensive immediately, his response in essence was, there is no military offensive going on. And this was pretty tough to take because it flew in the face of enormous visual evidence. His response to that was, the Western journalists are being tricked by Kosovo Liberation Army propaganda and disinformation. So there was a certain unreal quality to that part of the discussion. He knew very well that if I left the room without him changing his core positions, that there was no offensive, therefore he wouldn't stop it, kind of an odd position, and secondly, that he would not agree to the introduction of a NATO-led peacekeeping force. He knew that if I left the room without him agreeing to work on those two issues, that within a few hours, bombing would start. There was no question in his mind that the consequences would be bombing.
Why did Western diplomats expect Milosevic to bend on the issue he had ridden to power?
Milosevic had built his political career on Kosovo on a pledge to bring it under the control of Serbs. But Milosevic, in the past, had made many twists and turns. So it isn't unreasonable for the outside world, for the West, to expect Milosevic, perhaps at the last minute and under great threat, to prove flexible on this point, because part of his political skill is being a chameleon, of twisting and changing his colors.
I think that force is the language he understands best and respects most. And therefore, I think that in the end, given the positions he took, there was no alternative to the steps that NATO and the United States took.
On March 24, 1999, NATO began its bombing campaign over Kosovo, an assault like nothing the world had witnessed since the war in the Persian Gulf. Hundreds of thousands of ethnic Albanians have been driven from their homes, creating a massive humanitarian crisis.
Those security forces which are conducting this horrible rampage through Kosovo, killing young men, driving women, children, and old people out of the country in a historic refugee flow, proceed directly from instructions for which he is responsible. This is not 2 degrees of separation like Croatia and Bosnia. This comes directly from Belgrade. One of the great, horrible crimes of the second half of the century.
As the war provoked by Slobodan Milosevic continued, revelations of atrocities and ethnic cleansing committed by his forces prompted the War Crimes Tribunal at The Hague to act.
I presented an indictment for confirmation against Slobodan Milosevic and 4 others, charging them with crimes against humanity, specifically murder, deportation, and persecutions.
In May of 1999, for the first time in history, a sitting head of state, Slobodan Milosevic, was indicted for war crimes. Milosevic tolerated the destruction of his country by NATO's bombs for more than 2 months before he agreed to remove his troops from Kosovo.
I can announce that today that Milosevic has complied with the 5 conditions that the international community had placed, and therefore a few moments ago I instructed General Clark to suspend NATO's air operations against Yugoslavia.
Tonight, for the first time in 79 days, the skies over Yugoslavia are silent. The Serb army and police are withdrawing from Kosovo. The 1 million men, women, and children driven from their land are preparing to return home. The demands of an outraged and united international community have been met.
I want to say a few words to the Serbian people tonight. I know that you too have suffered in Mr. Milosevic's wars. As long as he remains in power, as long as your nation is ruled by an indicted war criminal, we will provide no support for the reconstruction of Serbia.
With the ceasefire, NATO peacekeepers, including American troops, were welcomed by the battered Kosovar Albanians. The Allied troops were charged with ensuring the safety of thousands of refugees returning home, as Serbian police and civilians made a hasty and often chaotic exit from the province. The war was over, but another stalemate with Milosevic began.
I don't know how you could deal with Milosevic any more than you could deal with Hitler. I mean, Milosevic has clearly, in my view, signed his death warrant in terms of being a member of any kind of a reasonable organization of leaders of this world. I think, quite frankly, that there are going to be an awful lot of people screaming for his immediate arrest and sent to The Hague. It's entirely possible that his own countrymen will do him in once they realize the danger, or rather the destruction that his own obstinance has caused.
After the war, the opposition to Milosevic mounted. Demonstrations took place calling for his resignation.
For the last 10 years, we've been tortured by Milosevic, and I think he should go.
But Milosevic and his family survived, even thrived. His son opened his amusement park called Bambi Park to the Serb public just a month after the war ended. Despite the hardship brought by his war to his own people and the pain of continuing international sanctions, the indicted war criminal held on to his power.
I would describe the sickening, sick man for power. Men will do anything to stay in power. He has no scruples. He has no word. He never kept his word. He lies consistently.
People always say, what is Milosevic planning next? What's his next move? And I don't think they understand. His mentality is not to have a plan. He doesn't have a plan. He doesn't know where he's going or what he's going to do next. He's just moving from one minute to the next, depending on where circumstances bring him. He's not a logical man. He's not a rational man.
The ultimate fate of Slobodan Milosevic, the architect of so much destruction across Yugoslavia, remained an open question.
I'm very surprised that he has lasted as long as he has, considering the grief that he's brought to the Serbian people.
It could end anyway. It could end in a violent episode. I can't imagine that Slobodan Milosevic is the kind of man who will peacefully give up office and sit out his days in retirement playing cards in a local cafe.
What's happened in Kosovo represents a new threshold in the demise of Slobodan Milosevic. He seems to have burned the bridges behind him without any regard for how either the international community or history will regard him.
Slobodan Milosevic died at the age of 64 on March 11, 2006, in custody at The Hague in the Netherlands. He had been on trial for war crimes in the killing fields of the Balkan states of Bosnia, Croatia, and Kosovo since 2002. This is the Biography Channel.
You want to be yourself, but you're not allowed to be yourself.
This is the Biography Channel.
I was just beside myself with anger and disappointment.
This is the Biography Channel.
I'm the only actress he knows you have to pay to keep your clothes on.
Reality meets personality, only on the Biography Channel.
Biography Channel. When it comes